Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Raheem Thompson. I am the manager of public programs. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, and the entire museum, I would like to thank you all for joining us as we celebrate Women's History Month with a very special program, Black Heroines of World War II, Women Who Fought the Nazis. This evening, we will be joined with Dr. Annette Joseph-Gabriel, who is an associate professor of Romance Studies at Duke University. Her research focuses on race, gender, and citizenship in the French speaking Caribbean, Africa, and France. She is the author of Reimagining Liberation: How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire, which was also awarded the Modern Language Association Prize for First Book and honorable mention for the Weber Award for the best book in modern French history. Uh, Dr. Joseph Gabriel will have a brief presentation. We will do a Q&A at the end of the program. So if you have any questions, please submit them whether before and during the presentation or afterwards. But with that said, I would like to bring on Dr. Joseph Gabriel.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Raheem Thompson, for the invitation, and to all of the staff of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for making this event possible. And I'm also looking at the list of attendees here, so thank you all for being here. It's a little bit kind of nerve-wracking to be on the webinar and not really see people and where you all are and what you're thinking and your reactions and your feedback. So please feel free to, drop any questions, reactions, thoughts, in the chat or using the Q&A function, as we go along so that we can kind of have that live exchange, go back and forth as we have this conversation today. So I'm really excited for our conversation today about Black women in World War II. As some of you on here may be aware, in November last year, France selected African-American singer, dancer, and actress Josephine Baker to be the first Black woman to be inducted into the Panthéon in Paris, right? So I'm gonna share my screen here because it always helps to kind of have some images, in front of you as you listen and kind of follow along with the story. All right. So, okay, so you should be able to see my screen here, right? And here is kind of the New York Times, news clipping, about Josephine Baker being inducted into the Panthéon in Paris. Baker, as many of you know, was born in 1903 in St. Louis, Missouri, in a segregated America. So stage performance became for her a ticket out of poverty. Finding that segregation limited the opportunities available to her here in the United States, she moved to France, where she quickly became the darling of French and European audiences. Her rise to fame was swift and inspiring. And now, nearly 50 years after her death, she has finally been recognized by the French government as a national heroine. As the site where France's most prominent citizens are buried, the Panthéon represents the French national values of liberty, equality, fraternity, right? When we think France, we think liberté, égalité, fraternité. Those values that were first articulated during the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. Long held as the founding principles of the French Republic, this tripartite motto came to represent the very meaning of France and of French identity. So today, if you look at any, official correspondence from the French government, right, you always have that letterhead with the red, white, and blue and the words liberté, égalité, fraternité, showing the long history of these ideals. These are at the core of what France is. But for a brief moment, for 4 short years, or well, really 4 very long years, right? Between 1940 and 1944, France was not France. During World War II, the Nazi collaborationist Vichy regime ushered in a new authoritarian government in France, headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain. State surveillance, arbitrary detention, and expulsions were the order of the day. Symbolically, Pétain abolished the tripartite motto, liberty, equality, fraternity, and replaced it with work, family, fatherland. Josephine Baker had fled white supremacy in America and had found in France the freedom to achieve her dreams of stardom. Now that France, her country of adoption, was no longer the France she knew, she decided to act. So Josephine Baker joined the French resistance. Using her fame to shield her from suspicion, she served as a spy. She reported on conversations among German officers who attended her performances, and she transmitted clandestine documents in her hair or in her bra or in the folds of her elaborate gowns. And she also hid, members of the French resistance at her home. Baker's participation in the French resistance, and that's the photograph that you see on here of her in full uniform, right? That's the photograph that was used to kind of memorialize her when the French government announced that she was going to be, honored at the Panthéon. So that's from the Élysée, you can see up there, that's the official announcement that was made. So Baker's participation in the French resistance stands today as proof that the true France, the Republic of Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity, was there all along. It was only temporarily suppressed during the turbulent period of the rise of fascism during World War II, and then quickly restored in 1945 with the defeat of Nazism, thanks to the help of heroes and heroines like Josephine Baker. That is how the story goes. But I'm not a historian. My training is in literature. So I'm less interested in establishing what happened, the events, right? I leave that up to the very capable hands of historians. I'm more interested in examining the narrative, the stories that we tell today about the past. So let's look at this story again. This story about how a Black woman in the French resistance came to embody the very spirit, the values of France. This story about how the violence of fascism in France was the exception and not the rule, about how the suspension of liberty, equality, fraternity happened only in the years between 1940 and 1944. Right, that's the story that we hear when we focus on Josephine Baker. But how does this story change when we shift our protagonist from a single exceptional African-American woman in France? And Baker was exceptional and courageous. But when we shift to several, multiple Black women, this time from the French colonies, if Baker's story is supposed to teach us that France is where Black people from the United States go to find freedom from racism, what might we learn from the stories of Black women from Africa and the Caribbean, who as colonized subjects had seen France at its worst, who had seen the suspension of liberty, equality, fraternity long before Nazi occupation in the 1940s? I'll try to answer these questions by telling you some stories. In August 1944, as General Leclerc marched into Paris to liberate the city from German occupation, André Blouin marched into the mayor's office in Bangui, a French territory in Central Africa, to obtain a quinine card for the malaria treatment that would save her 2-year-old son, René. Quinine cards were for Europeans only, and the French mayor let the distraught Métis woman know this in no uncertain terms. So you can see a picture of André Blouin on your screen here. André Blouin in the sort of French colonial classification was categorized as Métis, right? Which means mixed race, because her father was French and her mother was from one of the African colonies, French African colonies at the time. So she was classified as mixed race. And this classification matters, right? Because the law said that quinine cards to treat malaria were, to gain access to malaria treatment were only for Europeans. And so she goes into the office to, request this quinine card to save her son's life. Her son was 2. Colonial guards dragged her out of the office as she screamed, "I am a French citizen, the same as you, and so is my son. Yours is an accursed race, cursed authors of a murderous law." René never received the malaria medicine. He died a few days later. In her autobiography, Andrée Blouin maintains that the events of World War II and her son's death in a seemingly far-flung outpost of the French Empire in Africa were actually linked, right? So this is a quote from her autobiography. She says, "I have been asked, why would white people be so cruel to a child who was 3/4 white? My answer is this: this was deepest equatorial Africa, and the war was on," end quote. The institutionalized racism in the colonies, right, that viewed people of color as dispensable bodies on the battlefields of Europe was also at work in what Blouin called the murderous law that reserved anti-malaria treatment for whites only. As a colonized subject, the France that she saw that day in the mayor's office was very different from the one that had welcomed Josephine Baker fleeing from racism in the United States. Or more accurately, it was the same France, but with 2 different faces. And I want you to hold this image in your mind, right, of France having 2 different faces that it projects outward, that it shows to the world, because it is an image that I will return to as I talk about some of the other women who also analyze, right, what France meant to them. And so what you're seeing on your screen here is a screenshot from the New York Times. In 2020, the New York Times finally published an obituary for Blouin. It's a column that they have called Overlooked No More, and it's obituaries for people who they believe made a difference but were overlooked for so long. And so this happened for Blouin only in 2020. And you can see here, even in the New York Times, right, they explain that it was that moment, right, that moment of refusal from the French colonial administrator, that moment that killed her son, is what politicized her and what galvanized her political activism, her anti-colonial activism in the years to come. So in my book, Reimagining Liberation, How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire, and I'm showing it to you here because my editor will be very upset if I don't do that, but also because I love the cover, right? The cover image is by a Black French artist whose name is Alexis Peskin, who has roots in Guadeloupe, right? Another French territory, this time in the Caribbean, and it shows this Black woman, and she's kind of surrounded by those colors of the French flag, right? The tricolore, the red, white, and blue. So in this book, I talk about the political activism of 7 Black women. Like Blouin, all of these women found that World War II was a crucial turning point in their political consciousness. As the death of Blouin's son René shows, liberty, equality, fraternity had always been at best selectively applied in overseas France. So now that those values were completely suspended in Europe as well, Black French women saw a unique opportunity to fight on 2 fronts, to fight against both colonialism and fascism. And in so doing, they continued to redefine the idea of citizenship and belonging in France. Now, I'm saying both colonialism and fascism, like they're 2 different things, but in reality, right, what the writings of these women show us is that those things are linked. Right, so Aimé Césaire's book, Discourse on Colonialism, for example, is an excellent book that shows the linkages between fascism and colonialism. So what I want to do for the rest of my talk is to tell you a little bit about these actions, right? These political actions, the work of these women in the French resistance. 4 of these 7 women, because I don't have time to talk about all 7. Hopefully I can do 4. But I want to tell you a little bit about what they did during the war. So if we think about that title, Overlook No More, right? What happens when we remember Black women who also participated in the French resistance? What did they do during the war? And how did their activism, how did their experience in the war spark their political activism? But beyond showing you that women did important and courageous things during World War II, what I really want to show you is how their wartime action influenced their refusal of French colonialism and their vision for equality and political representation in France. So I will start with the first person, who's Suzanne Sizier. Suzanne Sizier was born on the French Caribbean island of Martinique in 1915. She studied philosophy in France, where she met and married the Martinican philosopher and writer Aimé Césaire. So for most people, when you hear about Martinique, the first person that comes to mind is Aimé Césaire. Suzanne Sizier contributed also to that intellectual movement in which he participated. So she's living in France, she's studying in France, she meets and marries Aimé Césaire. And then in 1939, with war looming on the horizon, the Césaires returned to Martinique aboard the ship, the SS Bretagne. Second thing to hold in your mind, right, aside from the two faces of France, is the name of the ship, SS Bretagne. It'll come back in our story. So when they arrived in Martinique in this period of war, they founded the journal Tropique, which published essays, poetry, and other short stories that condemned both colonialism and fascism, and that turned to movements like surrealism to propose new ways of thinking. The essays in Tropique in particular were camouflaged as ethnographic studies, right? So they were like, oh, these are just super academic intellectual texts. But in reality, right, when you read closely, they're really condemning what's going on in Europe and throughout the world. Eventually, however, Césaire's cleverly disguised essays could not escape government censorship. And so the Vichy government chief of information services, Lieutenant Bayle, banned the journal, accusing its editors of being racists, sectarians, and poisoners of souls. We'll see a little bit more about that language, right? But that ban of the journal was really quite similar to current attempts to ban what is loosely being defined as critical race theory here in the United States. And in France, what is being called Islamo-gauchisme, right? Islamic leftism, right? That supposedly there are these intellectual currents, running through universities and other educational institutions that need to be banned because they're particularly radical. Well, we can kind of trace that intellectual genealogy to Suzanne Sizier and her own radical writings against racism, against fascism, against colonialism in Tropique. So this was the accusation, right? That these Black Martinican philosophers were the real racists. Césaire responded to the accusations of racism and sectarianism that the state had leveled against the editors of this journal to justify its ban. I'll show you, the letter that she wrote, because it is a really powerful letter. I know that I'm breaking all the PowerPoint rules because it's a huge chunk of text, but we're going to pull out specific words. So here's what she writes in response to the censorship of the journal. She says, "Sir, we have received your indictment of Tropique. Racists, sectarians, revolutionaries, ingrates and traitors to the country, poisoners of souls," right? These are all in quotes because those are the things that were written in the letter. She says, none of these epithets really repulses us. Poisoners of souls, like Racine, ingrates and traitors to our good country, like Zola, revolutionaries, like the Hugo of Châtillon, sectarians, passionately, like Rimbaud and Lautréamont. Racists, yes, of the racism of Toussaint Louverture, of Claude McKay, and Langston Hughes against that of Drummond and Hitler. As to the rest of it, don't expect for us to plead our case, nor vain recriminations, nor discussion. We do not speak the same language. There is a lot that I can say about this response, right, to the French administration, about Césaire's gesture of presenting French and Afro-diasporic writers and political figures, right? So she goes through France, you have the classics, right? Rimbaud, Lautréamont, Victor Hugo, Émile Zola, Racine, right? Those are like French classics, the heavyweights. And Afro-diasporic thinkers and political figures as well, right? You have Toussaint Louverture from the Haitian Revolution. You have Claude McKay and Langston Hughes, right? Harlem Renaissance writers and thinkers. But she presents them not in a hierarchy, but as a constellation of thinkers whose different strands of knowledge shape the composite vision of her journal's anti-fascism. But what I want to focus briefly on really is the closing declaration. We do not speak the same language expresses Sizier's refusal to engage with the fascist government on its own terms. So she takes the state's terms, the words of the accusation, racists, sectarians, revolutionaries, and she redefines them as the starting point of her challenge to fascism. So sometimes when I present this letter, people in the audience ask, well, we do not speak the same language. Isn't she closing off the possibility of debate? What Suzanne Sizier is teaching us here is not so much how to debate, but when to debate. I think that in today's political discourse, we sometimes fetishize debate, right? Everything is a matter of debate. We should be able to hear all the sides. But when it is a matter of people's lives, when it is a matter of reducing whether people should live or be marked for death to an abstraction to be debated, because let's be honest, right? Racism, white supremacy, fascism, those are matters of life and death. Those are about whether certain people can live or are marked for death. When we reduce all of those to just abstract items to be debated, that in itself is an act of violence. Suzanne Sizier emphasizes life in her writings rather than the reduction of human life to mere points of debate. When Suzanne Sizier stepped off the SS Bretagne, the ship has come back in our story, onto Martinican soil in September 1939, she had no idea that the ocean liner's return voyage to France would be its last. Nor could she know that her compatriot and fellow writer, Paulette Nardal, would be aboard the vessel during its harrowing last days as one of the first casualties of World War II. Nardal was a writer, a journalist, an avid choral singer, and soon to be English teacher who had been living for the last several years in France. And so I love this picture because it's Paulette who's standing, looking directly at us on the camera, and her two sisters, or two of her sisters, right? They were 7 sisters in all, and Paulette was the oldest. And you have this kind of moment of joyful kind of, family bonding and connection here. But it's also a projection of a particular class image, right? Because they're reading this book, or looking in this book, and they're all very well dressed. Paulette Nardal was from a upper middle class family, Black family in France. Nardal had been living for several years in France, working as a journalist. She had a journal in France. She had returned home to Martinique to work on a tourist film at the request of the Minister of the Colonies, Georges Mandel. She was fully expecting her stay on the island to be temporary. And so she had left her Paris apartment in the care of the building's concierge. 2 months later, she was still in Martinique, working on the film project when World War II broke out. Determined to return to her home, her life, and her work in Paris, Nardal secured passage aboard a banana carrier and arrived at the dock at Fort-de-France an hour before the scheduled departure, only to learn that the ship had already left. Telegrams dispatched to Martinique were warning of German submarine attacks, and so the captain had thought it prudent not to linger. Nardal must therefore have been relieved to find space on the next departing ship that was leaving for France, the SS Bretagne, that had brought the Siziers home, and that was now making its return journey, right, from Martinique back to France. On October 13th, A month after her departure from Martinique, and with the ocean liner one day away from the English coast, Nardal's relief at finding passage on the ship turned to horror. The liner was torpedoed by the German submarine U-45. She would later recall the German guns hammering away at the section of the ship where the lifeboats reserved for women and children were stored. Nardal had to act quickly. 3 times, she tried to grasp a knotted cord and attempt the daring maneuver of climbing down the side of the ship into one of the lifeboats. 3 times, she failed. Then there was a loud explosion, and she felt herself fall into the void and land knees first in a lifeboat. She lifted herself onto a bench and spent an agonizing 4 hours waiting for a rescue ship. Nardal's injuries were so extensive that during the first days of her nearly year-long recuperation at City Hospital in Plymouth, as German Luftwaffe bombs rained down on the city, medical personnel were reluctant to send the telegram that Nardal had composed to her family because they were convinced that she would not survive. And here on your screen, you have a picture of Nardal, lying in her hospital bed, in Plymouth, recovering. She spent nearly a year in hospital, and here she's being visited by the mayor of Plymouth and his wife. She eventually managed to return to Martinique right after that year of recuperation. She returned with no possessions, no source of income, a terror of loud noises, and a permanent limp. Nardal had to depend on her elderly father's meager income to survive, and she supplemented it by giving English classes to Martinican dissidents who were preparing to leave from Martinique to neighboring English islands, from where they would continue to Europe to join the French resistance, right? So that was Nardal's kind of small contributions to the French resistance, was teaching them English, right? Enough English so that they could make this trip to Europe to join the resistance. Nardal's wartime injuries put France's values of equality to the test and quickly showed its limits, right? So remember that I said earlier that when we shift our focus away from someone as exceptional as Josephine Baker, and we look at someone like Paulette Nardal from a French colony, right? How does that shift change the story that we know about France as always the land of liberty, equality, fraternity? Nardal wrote to the governor of Martinique, a colonial administrator whose name was Georges Louis Ponton, requesting disability benefits and compensation for her losses as a French citizen who was injured during the war, right, while undertaking cultural work for France. It took 2 years for her request to Ponton for disability benefits due to her war injuries to make its way through the French bureaucratic process. In that time, Ponton died, and his successor, the next governor of Martinique, Georges Parisot, took charge of the dossier. As World War II raged on, and letters and telegrams shuttled back and forth between the governor's office in Fort-de-France and the Colonial Commission in Algiers, Nardal waited for news. The blow came in 1945 in a telegram from Algiers. Nardal was not eligible for compensation because there was no legislation that recognized civilian casualties in colonies that had not suffered direct damage in the war. Her claim to indemnity as a war victim had been denied, and with it, all the contributions that Martinique had made to the war effort. Distance from France, right, distance from Europe, meant the erasure of the very real losses that the island and its people had suffered, right, expressed here in the language of a supposed absence of direct damage. So essentially, Martinicans were equal enough to be drafted into the war, but not equal enough to receive benefits. Unlike Suzanne Sizier, who wrote that incendiary letter denouncing fascism directly, Nardal doesn't really come across in this story as having done anything heroic. She's rather the victim of a German attack. So why do I include her in this story? Like André Blouin, her experience of trauma sharpened her resolve to advocate for full citizenship rights for Black women, in this case, for Martinican women. And so Nardal started a journal in Martinique, and she wrote an editorial titled Martinican Women in Politics. In that editorial, Nardal argued that Martinique should draw attention to itself, and you can see that quote here, through the importance of female participation in decisive elections. She says we must present the true face of Martinique this time to France and to the world. Remember, I talked about that, the different faces of France. Nardal says there's a real France, there's a real Martinique, and it is through women's political participation that we can show that true face. Discovering the true face of Martinique for Nardal was a collective reflexive process. And so she continues in that editorial, in order to better clarify our choice, right, their political choices, we have the duty to inform ourselves about social questions and involve ourselves in deep reflection based on knowledge of ourselves and observations of reality. Essentially, Nardal argues here that women's political participation goes beyond the simple act or the single act of casting a vote, right? It also involves a collective self-consciousness cultivated by knowledge of the political, social, and economic realities on the island. Facing intersecting oppressions as Black women, colonized subjects, Martinican women's contributions to political life signaled for Nardal the advent of a more democratic post-war France. Let me pause here and say why what Nardal wrote is actually more radical than it seems. The very first announcement that Marshal Philippe Pétain made when he took over, right, when the Vichy regime came to power, was addressed to the overseas colonies of France. And it said, your duty is to obey, right? He said, I represent the fatherland, your duty is to obey. Nardal is doing something really subtle here, right? She moves away from that idea that one is to obey this authoritarian government and says it is through our knowledge and our deep reflection, right? Observations of reality that we come to this political consciousness. So Nardal is saying that the agency really lies with Martinicans and not with any authoritarian government. Born in French Guiana on November 23, 1891, Eugénie Éboué-Tell is often remembered simply as the wife of Félix Éboué, the Guyanese governor of Chad, who was the first French administrator to respond yes, right, the famous oui, to Charles de Gaulle's rallying call to form the Free French Forces. So here in this photo, you can see Eugénie Éboué-Tell in the middle. Next to her is her husband, Félix Éboué, and on the other side is their daughter, Ginette, who was the first wife of Léopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of Senegal. But Eugénie Éboué-Tell was more than just the wife of a high-ranking colonial official. She also publicly supported Charles de Gaulle and participated in the French resistance. She joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and served as a nurse at a military hospital in the French Congo between 1941 and 1944. Because of her efforts for the French resistance, the Vichy government in France condemned her to death, right? So she was condemned to death in absentia because she was living in Central Africa at the time. The government in France condemned her to death in absentia and seized her home in France and all her belongings. Her children were held hostage in occupied France, including her sons Robert and Henri, who were held in a prisoner of war camp. Éboué-Tell's wartime service and her later political work earned her much recognition, including at least 26 medals in France, Ivory Coast, and other countries. Her citations include 3 of France's highest honors: a Médaille de la Résistance in 1945, a Croix de Guerre avec Palme, and a Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur in 1946. So I mean, these are like the highest military honors that one can, or the highest honors that one can attain. After the war and her husband's death in 1944, Éboué-Tell ran for office and became the first Black woman elected to the French Parliament, which was then called the Constituent National Assembly. She represented Guadeloupe in the assembly from 1945 to 1946. And then after her brief tenure, right, so during that time, she helped actually to draft the constitution of the French Fourth Republic. And then after her brief tenure, right, just that 1 year in 1946, she was elected to the Senate, right? Also one of the first Black women in France's Senate, where she continued that work advocating for equal rights for France's overseas subjects in concrete terms that went beyond just symbolic gestures, of like rewriting the Constitution, for example. So she was really interested in like concretely, how will these changes in this immediate post-war moment really ensure actual liberty, equality, fraternity for all, right, in terms of their lived experiences. Like Éboué-Tell, like Nardal, like Blouin, like Sizier, her wartime experiences again served as a stepping stone for this activism. So throughout her time in Parliament and later as a senator, Éboué-Tell argued that women's contributions to the army and to the wartime economy during World War II had prepared them to take up positions of authority in politics and in the workforce after the war. So, in 1945, when she was campaigning to be elected to the French Parliament, to represent Guadeloupe, she said the following in a campaign speech. She said, "For the first time, women have been called upon in France to enjoy the same electoral rights as men." And you can see that quote on your screen here. "If there are some women who ascend the steps of the Palais Bourbon, they must, by their work, courage, and dignity, show that they have long been ready to take up these duties." So here in the specific context of overseas France, Éboué-Tell is arguing that Black women have long been ready to participate actively and meaningfully in the French government, from which up until now, they had pretty much been excluded. Throughout her political career, Éboué-Tell continued to build on this idea of women's wartime service, right, as the stepping stone to garner support for feminist legislation. So for example, in 1947, she presented before the Senate a proposed law that would increase state financial assistance to single mothers, right? Now, this law, this proposition happened as a result of her collaboration with another woman, Gilberte Brossolette. Brossolette was the first woman vice president of the Senate, and she was the wife of the decorated resistance hero, Pierre Brossolette. So Gilberte Brossolette herself was a spy during the war. She was clandestinely relaying information between London and Paris for the Free French forces. The Gestapo arrested her husband in 1944, tortured and killed him. Like the Éboués, the Brossolettes also earned France's highest military honors for their work, including the Légion d'honneur and the Médaille de la Résistance. Why am I telling you about Gilberte Brossolette when I should be talking about Éboué-Tell? What is interesting to me here is that Éboué-Tell's collaboration with senators like Brossolette speaks to a specific feminist politics that is rooted in women's wartime resistance, right? So these were women who participated in the French resistance. And then out of that came this political activism and this political vision, right, for increasing state assistance really to women after the war, right? That equality needs to be made real, not just on paper. So their participation in the resistance became a platform from which to demand full recognition as citizens of France and to advocate for women's increased access to politics, education, employment, and state protection. Do you have room for one more story? When World War II broke out, Suzanne Sizier wrote essays denouncing fascism. Paulette Nardal challenged the colonial policies that excluded Martinican war victims from disability benefits. And Eugénie Éboué-Tell worked behind the scenes to free her children from occupied France. Of all of these women, Jeanne Vialle has the most dramatic story. I'm keeping an eye on the time because I really want us to have room for Q&A. So I'll kind of go a little bit quickly through Vialle's story. Essentially, Vialle was born in a French colony, right? In the French Congo. Her father was French, her mother was from the French Congo. She moved to France where she was living when World War II broke out. She started to work for the French resistance, also as a clandestine agent in the south of France. She was arrested in January 1943, and she was interrogated by Vichy police interrogators who found that she had all of this information in her possession, right? But that she had coded in language that they couldn't decipher. So this is a picture of Jeanne Vialle here, along with, a map of her geography in Central Africa. But essentially, right, here on your screen is a list. So when you go to the archives in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France, you have this really long list, which is essentially the list of documents that were found in her possession. She had train schedules, she had information about who were undercover Nazi police officers. She had information about, like copies of Charles de Gaulle's speeches, information about his movements, right? Like she had all of this information, all this intelligence, essentially. So when she was arrested and all these documents were uncovered, she was incarcerated for 4 months in a concentration camp in the south of France. And then she was transferred to a women's prison in Marseille until December 1943. Now, I'm telling you that I was sitting in the archives looking at all of these documents, right? You have a snapshot here on your screen. And I found 2 different versions of what happened to her next. So Vialle is moved from a concentration camp to a women's prison. Some sources from the French government say that she was then released. Other sources say that she broke out of prison. Other sources say that she broke out of prison, was snatched up, and then was eventually released. But eventually, right, she essentially just goes underground until World War II ends. Today, when I look at my records, right, that I was able to get from the archives in France, Jeanne Vialle's interrogation records and her case file are the only records that at least I have found of a Black French woman in a concentration camp during World War II. These documents are sealed and they're only accessible with special permission from the French government. So what you see on the screen here, right, is in 2014 was this request that I made to the French government. Can I see these files? And here was the letter of permission that I eventually received, from the Ministry of Culture and Communication. Vialle goes underground. She resurfaces after World War II in 1947. She creates her own political party, campaigns for election, and is elected into the French Senate, where she worked with women like Éboué-Tell until her death in a plane crash in 1953. Vialle started a journal where, like all these women, she explained that World War II and that activism, that work in the French resistance was a stepping stone for her political activism. She writes in her editorial, "The women who experienced the torture of prisons, the horror of concentration camps, the life of the hunted, and who for many years trembled in fear for their parents, their friends, their work colleagues, wanted to bring together all the women of overseas France in the spirit of fraternity to work towards the same goal, to allow all women to establish honorable and happy homes in a peaceful atmosphere." Vialle is saying here, like all the other women we have seen so far, that the trauma of World War II required renewed efforts towards true happiness, freedom, equality. But beyond what she's saying, again, as a literary scholar, what I'm most fascinated by is what she is doing with her language. By invoking the spirit of fraternity, she aligns her political vision with those of Republican France and not Vichy France. Remember, there are 2 Frances at this moment. There's liberty, equality, fraternity. There is work, family, fatherland. So when Vialle uses the word fraternity, right, she allies herself with the French Republic and not Vichy France. And so Vialle brings us full circle back to where we began. For Black French women who were not Josephine Baker, France was not always a country of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But by returning to that language after the war, Vialle showed that it could be, not by simply declaring that France was, that country of those values, but rather by showing that it really was, by extending full citizenship rights to overseas France. The women I have talked about here use the traumatic experiences of wartime as a starting point to imagine a better world for Black women in the French Republic. They did not just advocate for inclusion, for the crumbs of empire, but rather for dismantling the exclusionary ideas of citizenship that would unmake and remake France into a more democratic union. I think there are lessons that we can learn from them today. So I'm going to stop here. I'm so eager to hear your thoughts, your questions, and to continue the conversation with you all.
Well, thank you for your great presentation. Thank you so much. To start things off, I prepared a couple questions, but for those in the audience, if you have any questions, please submit them, and we will get to as many as we can. To start things off, can you explain what inspired you about the alternative political visions of liberation these powerful women had? Like, what was that spark that started everything for you?
Oh, wow, that is such a great question. So the thing that started all of this for me, I love telling stories. I grew up in Ghana, and my grandfather was the secretary of the first president of Ghana, right? So the president who moved us from, being a colony, we're an English colony, into independence. And I had always heard, these stories about the role that men played. But the story that my mother tells me is that on Independence Day, she was being carried by my grandmother, and they were dancing in a place that is now called Independence Square. The question for me when my mom tells me this story is, where were the women, right, in our political histories? And so, as somebody who studies French, I transferred that question from my own home country, where were the women, to think about these spaces I was studying, to think about France, Africa, the Caribbean. Where were the women, and what role did they play in these political movements in such a decisive and also turbulent time, right? I still really want to answer that question about Ghana, but for now, I've kind of started with the French context. And that was the question that sparked all of this research for me, was where were the women? And the answer is that even if our histories don't show them, they were there.
Well, thank you. And our first question, does France acknowledge the inequities of history which you shared today?
That's a really great question. It's a difficult question because the answer is yes and no, right? So there have been generally no, because here's the thing. France argues that because during World War II, like racial statistics were used to target people, France does not allow, like any kind of recognition of race. So whereas in the US, you check the box, like white or African American or, etc. In France, you can't do that, right? Those identities, those categories are not recognized because the argument is that they could be used for nefarious purposes like they were used during World War II. What that means, though, is that the inequalities that actually exist for people who, have ancestry in France's former colonies, those also become invisible, because those populations become invisible, right? So those inequalities are not really addressed in any structural manner. But when we think about the women I've presented here, there's a continuity, right? So in about 2015, right, during Francois Hollande's presidency, you had a Black woman who had, one of the highest positions in the French government as Minister of Justice, and that was Christiane Taubira. And Christiane Taubira is known also for pushing forward what became known as the Taubira Law, which demanded that France recognize slavery as a crime against humanity, right? And also institute a national day of recognition and remembrance for slavery. And so that has been passed and that continues. It's been over 10 years now, right? That was passed and that continues. And so I see in the legacy, the continued political legacy of these women, right? Like Éboué-Tell and Vialle, Black women who continue, some Black women in the French government today, continue to push for official recognition of these inequalities.
All right, so I have your book here, and I actually read it a few months ago, and something that was kind of new to me, that a couple themes that I thought were really, I wanted, if I had a chance to speak with you, I was going to ask you to expound upon a little bit. The theme of like decolonial citizenship, but also transnationalism. Like, can you? These are it's pretty heavy in the book. Can you talk? Can you expound about this? Can you talk about it a little bit, especially for the people who haven't read the book yet?
Yes. Okay, so essentially, right, I'm working with two ideas here, like you said, right? So decolonial citizenship for me, right, I've been talking about citizenship in this talk, is that these women were saying, okay, we are French citizens. We want to be recognized as French citizens, but that citizenship cannot be colonial citizenship. Right, all of those inequalities that we're seeing, André Blouin's son being left to die, that's colonial citizenship, right? That says that you can become a French citizen if you just assimilate in terms of your language and your culture and your religion and the way that you dress. And what always remains unspoken is that what one cannot really assimilate is the color of their skin, right? And so that people who are not white continue to be treated as second-class citizens. Decolonial citizenship is what these women propose. They didn't say, fine, we're just going to leave France and go off and do our own thing. They were like, okay, we will claim that French citizenship you are saying can be ours, but on our own terms, right? That we can be still Black and African and Caribbean, and right, like we can identify as all of these things and still be considered as French. And I will say that that struggle is still happening right now. Like I'm teaching a class right now called Black France. And we just read a book that came out in 2021, right, by a Black French author who says, well, my identity as Black and French is not really accepted, right? Like that struggle is still happening today. So decolonial citizenship says that we have to decolonize the idea of citizenship. It cannot be determined by an authoritarian state. It has to come from the ground up, from people themselves. But this movement to decolonize citizenship happens in a transnational network. None of these women worked alone, right? They were all always connected. Éboué-Tell and Vialle worked together in the Senate, right? Suzanne Sizier and Paulette Nardal kind of crossed paths, right? Like all of these women in the book, people often ask me, how did you choose the women in the book? I'm like, each one led me to the next. Because I will start with one woman and realize she's talking to another, right? That the idea of a transnational network that goes beyond the nation, so that decolonial citizenship is a national citizenship. I belong to France, but it's also a transnational citizenship, right? My belongings are rooted in the African diaspora, are rooted in, right, the Caribbean, are rooted in the global South, right? Like they were like, we can find lots of different political communities that we can belong to, and all those multiple citizenships don't cancel each other out. So those are kind of the two ideas that I'm trying to work with.
Yeah, and speaking of the transnationalism network, in the book, you actually tell stories with maybe it's one or two people per chapter. Um, how do you choose? How how did you pick seven? Like I'm sure there's more, and I'm sure as you were writing, you discovered more people. Like,
Yeah.
how did you pick seven and just say, I'm going to stick with these seven?
Oh my gosh. I mean, like I had to stop somewhere, right? Like I just wanted to keep going. And these are not even the most radical of the examples I found, right? Like I found some women who were just like ready to burn it all down. Okay. But these seven, I mean, I think that they are the ones who helped me the most to question why we remember some people and not others. Because most of these women that I talk about were connected to famous men, right? So Suzanne Sizier was married to Aimé Césaire. I talk about Eslanda Robeson, who was married to Paul Robeson, but like all of these women are often connected to men who are more recognizable. So sometimes people would ask me, what's your research? I say, I'm working on Suzanne Sizier. They're like, who's that? I'm like, Aimé Césair's wife. They're like, oh, Aimé Césaire, right? Same thing with, Eslanda Robeson, right? So these ones were the ones who helped me to say, well, why do we remember these famous men, but not the women who also participated so closely, right, in the work that they were doing? There were other women who were more radical, other women who also had more writings, but they were not as connected to these famous men. And so I think that the kind of question we would ask would be a little bit different for them. But there are women, who like we really need to learn more about. So I list some of their names in my conclusion. If you do decide to go out and get the book and read the book, like let's pull on those threads. Let's start to research those women and say like, what was going on with their stories as well.
Absolutely. And going back to the Q&A really quick. Let's see. We have a question comment. Let's see. Dr. Annette, you're a great storyteller. The New York Times article indicated Josephine's induction was symbolic. What did Josephine symbolize to France as an American in the height of her career and value she brought to France and its citizens versus what she meant to France towards the end of her career and how she was treated post Chateau? How you pronounce that?
Yeah, Chateau Milan.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is a great question. I mean, right. So Chateau Milan is basically, Josephine Baker. She purchased this castle right in the Dojon. It's beautiful, and that's where she lived. And okay, so let me start the question from the beginning. So I do believe, I mean, all inductions in the Pantheon are symbolic, right? Like everybody, the people that are chosen are symbols representing the values of France. So in that sense, Baker isn't unique. But you're absolutely right that she is unique in the sense that the timing of the choice, right? I mean, you've had, the George Floyd protests in the United States that spill over to France. You have these massive protests, against, police brutality, racialized police brutality in France, in summer 2020, and so the French government, we're going into an election. I mean, not even an election year, an election couple of weeks, right? In April, France is electing its new president. The French government had to show some kind of symbolic gesture, right, that it believed in anti-racism. And so, choosing the first Black woman was that gesture. But it's so striking, right? As you're asking the question, that the Black woman chosen is American, right? I mean, certainly she had French citizenship, but she comes to the United States. The symbol that she's meant to represent is that France is France is not a racist country, right? That unlike the United States, that was marked by segregation, by Jim Crow. I mean, like, oh, poor Josephine Baker had to flee to France, right? France is the land that welcomes everybody. And this is true in some sense, right? Baker's rise to stardom was incredible, and she was not the only one. If you read the book Bricktops Paris by T. Deneen Sharpley Whiting, I mean, there are like some 30 women in there, 30 Black women in there that she, kind of profiles to show how African-American women, gained this recognition in France. But the reality is that it is one thing to be an American woman in France and another to be a Senegalese or a Malian or a Martinican woman in France, right? The demands that you make on the French state as somebody coming from a French colony, as somebody who is demanding citizenship, is very different from the demands you make on the French state as somebody who's always viewed as an expatriate, right? So like that's the difference in the symbols, I believe, and why I think that we should think about Josephine Baker in a larger conversation with all of these Black women so that we get the totality of the story.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. Also, for everyone in attendance, if you had a question and didn't get a chance to send it, or you had a question and we didn't get a chance to answer it, Annette, do you have a way people can contact you or talk with you more about your book as they purchase it? It is available. I'm not sure if you can see it. Reimagining Liberation. I enjoy reading it. I'm sure you all will too. But yeah, do you have a way we can contact you?
Yes, absolutely. So if you go to my website is kind of like a one-stop shop, because then you can get, info on, how to get the book. You can see snippets. You can read the introduction of the book. And also there's a web form on there that you can use to contact me, right? And that goes directly to my inbox. And so that's a great way to get in touch. I love being in conversation with people. Can I just show you? Okay, I know we're out of time, but let me just say real quick
No
that.
worries.
Okay, so the photograph I showed you all of Paulette Nardal lying in that hospital bed is not something that I found in the archives. I wrote, a story about Paulette Nardal on the internet, and a man sent me an email and said, "Hi, my grandmother was the nurse who took care of her when she suffered this attack, right, from the German submarine. And here's a photograph of that she autographed my grandmother," right? Like, I love talking to people about this, because then people share bits and pieces of their own histories, their own memories, and how all of those intersect. So please do be in touch. Please do stay in touch. I would love to continue the conversation. And thank you all so much for being here and for your really great questions.
Absolutely. Thanks again. I really enjoyed reading this, and I enjoyed your presentation. I'm sure we'll work together again in the future. And everyone else, have a great night. Thanks again for supporting us. You will have a survey at the end of the program. Please fill it out. And I hope to see you at the next program. Everyone, have a great night.